Before the 19th century, the total human population grew very slowly. By making small improvements in farming techniques, clearing forested land to expand land for crops, and finding new regions of the ocean dense in fish, people became more efficient at extracting energy from the environment. Around 1800, the population reached 1 billion. In the 200 plus years since then, world population has exploded. It's around 7.4 billion today. The United Nations predicts that it will reach nearly 11 billion by the year 2100. What problems and what opportunities will this growth present? No one really knows for sure. Geographers commonly use two different statistics to describe the rate at which children are born. The crude birth rate, or CBR, is the number of live births per year for each 1,000 people. In contrast, the total fertility rate, or the TFR, focuses on women in their childbearing ages of 15 to 49. TFR is the average number of children who would be born per woman of that group in a country, assuming every woman lived through her childbearing years. Compared to the crude birth rate, the total fertility rate more accurately reflects cultural norms, such as how people weigh the costs and benefits of having a child and how people perceive the role of women in society. In most of the world, the total fertility rate was higher in the past than it is today. In parts of Europe before 1800, it averaged 6.2 children. In those days, most people lived on farms, and having more children meant more people to work the land. However, so many children died as infants that people lived on average only about 40 years. So despite the high total fertility rate, population growth was pretty slow. Beginning in the mid-18th century, Europeans began having fewer children. Part of this was unintentional. During this time, countries began keeping longer standing armies, so more men were away from home for longer periods. But most of it was intentional. With the Industrial Revolution, when people began to rely more on machines than on muscle power to produce goods, couples decided they needed fewer children. But industrialization also enabled people to live longer. So even though total fertility rate declined, population growth increased. Cultural, economic, political, and environmental realities have always shaped decisions about whether to have children. Since these conditions have varied across time and culture, so have birth rates. How people viewed the role of women in a society has been a particularly important factor influencing total fertility rate. Over the past 250 years, as countries industrialized, people moved from rural areas to urban areas and found work in factories. Many women became factory workers or domestic help. They lived in small apartments or small houses in cities, and families became smaller. Urban families did not need children to work their farmland, and they were living already in crowded spaces. When factories became common in the early 19th century, children worked in them alongside adults. But in the later part of the century, governments passed laws prohibiting child labor and began opening public schools. And as young women obtained more schooling, they began to expand their work opportunities. The longer they stayed in school, the fewer children they had, a trend that continues to the present day. In the United States, we have shown a similar pattern of delayed marriage and childbirth. As educational opportunities increased for women between 1950 and 2010, the median marriage age of women increased from just over 20 years of age to nearly 27. The average age at which women gave birth to their first child has increased as well. And throughout the 20th century, the spread of family planning information and changes in technology aided people who wanted to choose the number of children they had. In countries with wide access to family planning methods, including the United States and many countries in Europe, couples gave birth to their first child later in life, had fewer children, had fewer unintended pregnancies, and had larger intervals between having children. In these places, the total fertility rate continued a decline that began with the Industrial Revolution. Religious values also shape attitudes towards having children. Some religious traditions oppose certain forms of family planning. Women who follow traditional religious beliefs, regardless of their particular religion, have higher fertility rates than those who do not. These women are less likely to use birth control and less likely to be employed outside the home. Governments also influence the total fertility rate. Concerns about overpopulation, the growth of the population beyond what an area can support, can have led to anti-natalist policies, programs to decrease the number of births. The Chinese government introduced two different anti-natalist policies in the 1970s. The first, known as Later, Longer, Fewer, was introduced in 1972. It encouraged parents to get married later in life, wait longer between children, and as a result, have fewer children. The impact of the Later, Longer, Fewer policy can be seen in China's population pyramid in the relatively shorter bars for the 40 to 44 and 35 to 39 cohorts. The expansion in births in the 25 to 29 and 30 to 34 cohorts is the result of the large number of women who entered childbearing age in the mid-1980s. Later, Longer, Fewer did result in reduced fertility, but not as quickly as officials wanted. In response, China instituted its one-child policy in 1979. Parents who had more than one children were subject to fines, although the law made exceptions for rural couples and ethnic minorities. The policy remained in effect until 2016. During that period, China's fertility rate decreased. However, researchers disagree on how much of the decline resulted from the policy and how much from other factors, such as increased education for women. One effect of China's one-child policy was that it reduced the number of adult workers in the country. Concerns that a smaller workforce would reduce economic growth and would lead to a shortage of workers to support the elderly led the government to reevaluate the policy. In addition, the policy contributed to unbalanced gender ratio. Chinese culture has long preferred male children over females, so when some couples learned that their one child would be a girl, they chose to have an abortion or to immediately give the infant to an orphanage and not register the birth with the government. By doing this, they could have another child who might be male. By 2010, China had 118 males born for every 100 females. The gender imbalance was so great that Chinese leaders feared it would lead to a greater crime and civil unrest among young men who felt they had no prospects to get married and have children. In 2016, the Chinese government modified the controversial program and now allows families to have 2 children. While China's one-child policy was the most comprehensive population control plan, other countries have used more targeted programs. In European nations, birth control education decreased teenage pregnancy. In Africa and South Asia, laws banning child marriage raised the average marriage age and the age that a woman had her first child. Throughout history, some governments have encouraged large families. Governments have believed that a growing population stimulating economic growth and increased military power. In recent decades, a variation of this reasoning has emerged in some highly developed countries. As fertility rates dropped but people lived longer, the percentage of elderly people increased. To keep the economy vibrant, countries such as France, Sweden, and Japan have instituted pro-natalist policies, or programs that were designed to increase the fertility rate. For example, they have provided paid time off from jobs held by mothers, free childcare, and family discounts on government services. Even though the total fertility rate worldwide has been decreasing, the world's population continues to grow. And this growth reflects a decrease in the death rate and an increase in how long people live. The most important factor in the increase in global population is the rise in life expectancy, the number of years the average person will live. It is commonly expressed from the time of a person's birth, but it can be calculated at any point in his or her lifetime. A century ago, the global life expectancy was about 34 years at birth. Today, it's nearly 70. In most of Europe, life expectancy at birth is more than 80 years. However, in less developed areas, such as many sub-Saharan African countries, life expectancy at birth is less than 50 years. One of the most important factors increasing life expectancy is the drop in the infant mortality rate, the number of children who die before their first birthday. For example, in the state of Massachusetts, the infant mortality rate decreased from 130 out of each 1,000 live births in the 1850s to about 4 today. Over the past 250 years, several advances in agriculture have helped increase the life expectancy. Mechanizing food production, such as replacing horses with tractors, improving seeds, fertilizers, and farming techniques through research by state, university, and private companies, and transporting products more efficiently in trucks, trains, and ships, often on roads, rail lines, or canals built with government support. In the United States in 1800, almost everyone farmed. Today, farmers make up less than 3% of the population, yet they produce enough food to feed everyone in the country and export vast quantities. Advances in agriculture, such as the following, had effects that rippled through society. Greater farming efficiency freed people to work in non-farm industries, easing the transition to industrialization. Food security improved around the world. Hunger and famine still occurred because people were too poor to purchase food, or because of political or distribution problems, not because of an actual food shortage. As farms depended less on manual labor, farm families became smaller. The use of machinery meant that one person could farm more acres. Many small farms were consolidated into larger farms, and the owners of those consolidated farms moved to urban areas. As the population of rural areas decreased, and cars and better roads allowed people to travel farther and more easily, many small towns that had served farmers disappeared. As early industrial cities grew, so did the problems of large concentrated populations, such as the spread of cholera and other diseases through water contaminated by human waste, as well as plague, which is carried by fleas that live on rodents. One of the most important advances in reducing mortality was the creation of public sewer systems. Before the Industrial Revolution and in its early years, people in cities dumped human waste into streets and rivers. The waste often reached the water supply, contaminating the water and making people sick. Especially vulnerable to disease were children and the elderly. Then cities began to install sewer systems, which protected water supplies from contamination and increased life expectancy. People also learned that boiling water before they used it could prevent transmission of waterborne illnesses. That worked before citizens decided to pay for clean water through taxes. Communities began to install water treatment plants that transported clean water to the homes in the cities. Cities also created departments of public sanitation and started to collect garbage and other waste produced by city residents. By doing this, cities reduced the number of rodents that fed on the waste and often carried disease. Improved medical care coincided with improvements in food production and sanitation. The development of vaccines to prevent disease, antibiotics to cure diseases, and improved medical procedures boosted life expectancy. Prior to the 1800s, smallpox killed as many as 400,000 people each year. However, in the 1700s, Dr. Edward Jenner figured out that if he infected people with cowpox, a much milder disease related to smallpox, those people would be immune to smallpox. Jenner's work led to a smallpox vaccine. Today, efforts by the United Nations, national governments, and private organizations to vaccinate people around the world have been so successful that no case of smallpox has been reported since 1977. Jenner's work was also the basis for vaccines against other serious diseases, such as polio, tuberculosis, and rabies. While vaccines help prevent people from getting ill, antibiotics help cure people who had bacterial infections. The first widely used antibiotic was penicillin, which came into use in the mid-1900s. Before penicillin, deadly bacterial infections killed many people. The deadliest epidemic in history was the plague, which was spread by flea bites. During the mid-1300s, the plague killed about 200 million people in Europe alone. Other common bacterial infections include staph, which commonly killed people who got wounded in battle or suffered a deep cut, strep, and parasitic infections. Improved medical procedures have also extended life expectancy. Among these procedures was the development and improvement of surgery, which was often deadly before antibiotics. Now surgery is safe enough that it can help an individual suffering from a heart attack, stroke, cancer, or other ailments. Doctors have also saved the lives of pregnant women and their newborn children through the use of cesarean section surgeries.